good evening. Tonight, we settle into a world you would not wish upon anyone. Imagine yourself as a medieval soldier. You are trudging across a vast frozen field after a long day's march. Snow crunches loudly and deliberately beneath your worn leather boots. Every single breath you take fogs the air before your face. It looks like a small and weary ghost vanishing into the deepening twilight. Your weary shoulders ache with a deep pain beneath your heavy armor. The cold metal has absorbed far too much of the day's biting chill. Your fingers twitch almost uselessly inside their stiff leather gloves, feeling completely numb. The soldiers' camp finally lies ahead in the distance. It is a small and hopeful cluster of flickering orange lights. The faint smell of wood smoke promises a brief rest from marching. You know you are only minutes away from the one place a soldier could collapse. That single place is the military field tent. But before we crawl inside this refuge, let me give you a friendly reminder. If you enjoy our journeys into these quiet nights of history, please subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes. It helps our channel continue to bring these stories to you. We greatly appreciate your support. You finally reach the edge of the sprawling camp. The warm glow of the central firelight feels like a fragile and distant promise. A medieval army on the move certainly carried tents, but these shelters were nothing like your modern waterproof cocoons. They were bulky, heavy canvas or thick linen. The fabric was stretched taut over a frame of crude wooden poles, sometimes splintered and worn. You duck your head and shoulder your way inside a tent. The immediate smell of damp wool smoke and unwashed bodies hits you. The tent's roof is low, so you must crouch to move about. Your chainmail and armor clank loudly in the quiet space. You lower yourself onto the ground. The floor feels like half frozen earth and half thick mud. It depended entirely on the day's cruel weather. One mainstream fact to keep in mind is that campaigns often ran into winter. This was not because generals enjoyed punishing their men with extreme cold. It was because wars rarely respected the neat turning of weather calendars. Chroniclers from the 100 Years' War mentioned soldiers digging in through December. Their simple canvas tents sagged heavily under the immense weight of accumulated ice and snow. Many medieval soldiers swore their best insulation was not the cloth above their heads. It came from what they managed to pile beneath their bodies. They used fallen branches, thick hay, or even battlefield debris. Broken shields were sometimes stacked flat to lift them off the frozen ground. Think of this practice as the medieval version of a modern camper's simple sleeping pad. Yet here is where historians still debate the truth. Just how effective were these tents at keeping soldiers alive through a real winter's night? Some historical records suggest the canvas was terribly thin. Snow and wind blew straight through the seams, soaking everyone inside. Others argue a tent provided a surprising amount of good insulation, especially when it was packed tightly with men shoulder to shoulder for warmth. You sit in the dim glow, hearing muffled voices. Comrades settle down all around you in the dark. The wind claws relentlessly at the canvas walls. Each powerful gust makes the ropes creak. The stakes groan deep within the frozen earth. You can feel a constant draft swirling across the floor. It chills your exposed ankles to the bone. You realize the tent itself is both sanctuary and tormentor. Its flimsy walls rise up only a few feet. They sag inward where heavy snow has gathered on the canvas. Your own breath lingers in the stale air. It drifts slowly toward the blackened roof. Smoke stains reveal how often fires have filled this space. The whole structure is simply a shell against the wind. One plain historical fact is that tents were not luxuries, but logistics. Commanders carried them on long trains of wooden carts. Each pole and canvas bundle weighed dozens of pounds. Nobles claimed the larger pavilion-style tents. These were brightly dyed to proudly mark their high rank. Common foot soldiers made do with smaller, plainer shelters. Now for a more curious detail about survival. Soldiers sometimes stuffed bits of animal fat into tent seams. They hoped this greasy substance would repel the rain and snow. The result was a faint, oily smell that clung to the fabric. It mixed with smoke to make the interior smell like a butcher's stall. Soldiers would take stench over frostbite any night. And yet historians remain divided on a key point. Did these makeshift shelters offer real protection in the long run? Some argue that tents provided little more than psychological comfort, a flimsy roof that tricked soldiers into thinking they were safe. Others suggest the communal aspect was key. Dozens of men packed tightly inside created a pocket of body heat. You crouch lower inside your shelter. You glance at the makeshift furnishings, but there are not many. A battered wooden chest serves as a crude stool for one man. A messy tangle of shields and spears leans in a corner. It takes up the one dry spot where you wish you could stretch your legs. The canvas rustles like a drum whenever the wind smacks it. The sounds around you are strangely intimate and constant. A companion snores, already his, breathing heavy and wet. Another soldier mutters something quietly under his breath. Perhaps it is a prayer, or maybe it is a curse. The sharp and ragged noise of a deep cough echoes again. Your own stomach growls loudly in the near darkness. For a moment you close your eyes. You imagine how fragile this fabric shelter truly is. One single spark from a torch could reduce it to ash. One strong gale of wind could rip it from its stakes. Yet as you listen to the low chorus of weary men, you also realize this is survival. The tent, with all its flaws, is what stands between you and the endless cold. You tug the heavy cloak closer to your body. You feel the rough woolen fibers scratch your chin. It is not glamorous or even remotely comfortable. But this cloak is more than just clothing right now. It is your mattress, your blanket, and your shield all at once. Wool is heavy, coarse, and faintly itchy against your skin. Yet wool is also the one material that stubbornly clings to warmth. It retains some heat even when it is damp. You lie back on the frozen ground. You roll the cloak's edges around your shoulders like a cocoon. You realize this single garment might mean the difference between a night's rest and a shivering ordeal until dawn. One solid historical fact is that soldiers relied heavily on their cloaks. They used them not only for marching, but also for sleeping. Chroniclers often describe soldiers lying down wrapped only in their cloaks. This was especially true on campaigns where carrying extra bedding was impractical. The cloak was a universal tool of survival. Here is a peculiar little detail you might find interesting. Some cloaks were so thick and oily they became water-resistant. Soldiers joked their cloaks could stand upright on their own. It was not just dirt that made them stiff. It was months of sweat, fat, and maybe mutton grease. Disgusting, sure, but surprisingly effective against drizzle or snow. Of course, scholars disagree over how much comfort these cloaks actually provided. Some argue that the thickness of wool genuinely offered good insulation. Others counter that without layers of straw or furs beneath them. Soldiers, wrapped in cloaks, still lost body heat to the icy ground. Was the cloak a true safeguard, or merely a thin excuse against nature? You shuffle against the ground, feeling the hard lumps of frozen earth. The cloak dulls some of the immediate sting, but every bone in your body still aches from the cold. You curl into a tighter ball, tucking your knees against your chest. That is the way warmth hides best when it is compressed, hoarded and conserved around your vital organs. You look around at the other men doing the same. Shapes under woolen folds become completely indistinguishable from one another. Men become mere bundles of fabric in the gloom. Only the occasional cough or soft murmur proves they are still alive. The air is thick with dampness. Your own breath condenses on the inside of your cloak. Picture the scene more closely now. You see cloaks in shades of brown gray and faded blue. Their edges are ragged and their hems are stiff from old mud. Each one tells a long story of battles fought and storms endured. And as you lie there cocooned in your own smelly scrap of wool, you realize you are no different from thousands of soldiers before you. You roll onto your side, clutching your cloak tightly. You instantly bump into another warm body. There is absolutely no privacy in this small tent. Survival here demands an immediate and unavoidable closeness. You hear the slow and steady rhythm of another man's breath. You feel the faint radiating heat from his body. You shuffle closer without even thinking. Warmth is a kind of precious currency in this frozen world. The only real way to get more is to share. You must share the little warmth you already possess with others. Soldiers routinely slept pressed shoulder to shoulder and hip to hip. Together they formed a sort of human furnace. Its collective heat was their best weapon against the biting cold of the night. One straightforward fact is that this practice was widespread. Chroniclers of the Crusades, for instance, mention this very thing. They wrote of men lying in heaps like dogs. They did this to stave off the cold desert nights. In the frozen forests of northern Europe, entire squads packed themselves into narrow tents. No one soldier could endure the brutal chill alone. And here is a quirky little tidbit from the past. In some armies, soldiers gave each other nicknames. These names were based on their sleeping habits. The one who snored too loudly might be called the bellows. The man who tossed and kicked all night became the mule. These names stuck with them even outside the tent. It was a small reminder that hardship often turned into humor. Yet historians still puzzle over the psychological effect. Did this communal sleeping foster true camaraderie or breed resentment? Some argue it built unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. Others counter that the constant proximity led to festering irritation. It spread lice and bad tempers more effectively than warmth. Did it pull men together or simply wear down their nerves? As you shift again in the dark, you notice the heat feels uneven. The side pressed against your comrade warms up quickly. Your exposed back, however, chills like a stone in the draft. So you roll again, awkwardly bumping into someone else. Now you are wedged between two bodies. The smell is pungent with sweat and leather, but you accept it. The noises within the huddle are constant and strangely comforting. Someone snores like a saw rattling the canvas with each breath. Another soldier coughs wetly into his rough woolen sleeve. A muttered prayer drifts slowly through the darkness. You even hear a dry, soft laugh somewhere nearby. as if one man finds the absurdity of this dog pile too much to bear. Imagine the entire scene viewed from high above. You would see a heap of cloaks and limbs tangled together. It would look like a nest of hibernating animals. The canvas walls of the tent bulge slightly outward, outside the wind claws at the ropes. But here you are, cushioned by living walls of flesh and fabric. You are not alone in this cold night. The fire is the beating heart of the entire camp. You can hear it long before you ever see it. You hear the crackle, the low pop, and the occasional hiss. Step outside your tent flap, and you find it there. A small ring of embers, pulsing red and orange. A few logs lean against one another. They look like old men holding each other upright against the cold. The flames do not leap very high on this night. Instead, they crouch low to the ground. They gnaw at whatever scraps the soldiers could gather. Twigs, branches, or even bits of broken supply carts. Firewood is always scarce on a long campaign. Every man here knows that keeping this fire alive, keeping it alive through the night, is both salvation and a constant danger. One solid historical fact is that armies relied on campfires. They were used not only for cooking, but for sheer survival. Fires were deliberately placed at the center of tent groups. The feeble warmth could radiate outward into the canvas walls. Archaeological digs of old camps have revealed blackened soil, evidence of countless fires tended carefully through bitter nights. But here is a quirky detail that sneaks into the historical record. Men often tried to carry fire along with them. They would scoop up glowing embers into clay pots. They banked them under layers of ash to be rekindled at dawn. Imagine cradling a smoldering pot in your arms like a baby. This single ember was your ticket to warmth the next morning. And yet scholars still debate the ultimate risk. Did the great danger of fire outweigh the benefit it provided? Fires inside or near tents risked sparks catching on the canvas. Some argue commanders forbade open flames inside shelters entirely. Others believe small braziers were a common and desperate gamble. The written accounts often contradict each other on this point. You sit by the fire, now your face warmed while your back remains icy. That is the cruel trick of an open campfire. It never warms everything all at once. You stretch your hands forward until your palms begin to sting. Your cloak smells even smokier, now saturated with ash. You tilt your boots closer, hoping to dry the mud, careful not to scorch the precious leather. Picture the strange rhythms this fire created in camp life. Soldiers rotated not just guard duty, but also fire duty. Men stumbled out of tents to throw on another branch. Sometimes a log collapses with a sharp, startling crack. It sends up a burst of light that illuminates the tents. For a moment, the camp looks like a living painting. Shadows dance on exhausted faces. You cannot linger by the fire for too long. If you fall asleep here, you risk waking up in smoke. So you retreat again to your chilly tent. You bring with you the ghost of the heat from the flames. Your cloak still carries the warmth like a fragile memory. You curl again into your corner, imagining the embers glowing. That fragile light out there is what keeps the entire camp breathing. You wake in the middle of the night. For a moment, you do not know what has roused you. Then you feel it, a scratchy rasp against your cheek. The faint tickle travels across your tired arm. You shift slightly and realize something is different. Beneath you is not earth alone, but something rougher. A pelt. This hide is a simple shield between your body and the merciless ground. One straightforward fact is that soldiers frequently relied on animal skins. Hides from sheep, goats, or even deer were spread across tent floors. In wealthier armies, knights had luxurious furs. A poorer soldier made do with whatever scraps he could find. The hide sometimes still carried the sharp scent of the animal. And here is a curious tidbit from the margins of history. In particularly harsh campaigns, soldiers were known to use fresh skins. They would strip them from freshly slaughtered animals. Then they would sleep on them while still steaming with body heat. Imagine lying on a half-warm, bloody hide. You would ignore the smell because it might save your toes from frostbite. But historians remain divided on just how widespread this practice truly was. Some argue that pelts were luxuries accessible mostly to knights. The rank and file, they say, relied solely on straw. Others point to records of soldiers being issued simple sheepskins. This suggests that hides were common even for the footmen. Was it standard issue or just a fortunate accident? You shift again, pressing your palm flat against the hide beneath you. It feels coarse, and the short hairs prickle your skin. Yet it does seem to hold a certain amount of warmth. The ground beneath it still radiates a deep and bitter cold. But the chill does not feel quite as fierce as it did before. The pelt is like a quiet whisper of unexpected comfort. You inhale, and the smell is earthy and musky. It has a faint undertone of smoke where someone dried it too quickly. Around you men shuffle in their troubled sleep. One soldier pulls his pelt closer, curling onto it like a dog. Another has no hide at all. You can hear his teeth chattering softly in the darkness. You hold onto your scrap of hide as if it were treasure. Think of the tactile details of this crude bedding. The greasy feel of half-tanned leather against your skin. The way the stiff fur rubs your cheek when you roll over. The dampness that seeps through when snow melt sneaks under the tent. You can almost feel the pelts stiffening over many days, clotted with dirt and sweat. Yet they were always kept. The camp outside murmurs with the lonely sound of the wind. The fire has dwindled to only faintly glowing embers. The canvas above you trembles with each powerful gust. You close your eyes again, your cheek resting against the pelt. For tonight, this scrap of an animal's past life, it keeps you from freezing into a final stillness. And right now, that is enough. You stir awake, and the first thing you notice is your feet. They feel swollen and numb at the very tips of the toes. A dull ache prickles them that stubbornly refuses to fade. You never took your boots off last night. You know the simple reason why. If you did, you might never get them back on your feet again in the morning. Frozen leather becomes as stiff as wood. Your laces would be crusted with unbending ice. Your toes might be too swollen to squeeze back inside. So you leave them on, always on, through the long night. You sleep in the very same boots that you march in all day. It is a necessary and constant discomfort you must endure. One undeniable fact is that medieval soldiers often slept this way. Chroniclers describe men too afraid of frostbite to risk exposing bare feet. Boots provided not just protection from the terrain, but a barrier against the cold. Removing them could mean waking to find them frozen solid, or your own feet frostbitten beyond any hope of repair. Here is the quirky part of this difficult practice. Soldiers sometimes stuffed straw moss, or even wool, into their boots. They layered the insides like primitive, insulated socks. The result was boots that bulged awkwardly and smelled of damp rot. but they trapped just enough precious heat. Some men even smeared animal fat inside to help seal out the invasive cold. Of course, scholars still wrestle with the long-term consequences. Some argue that constantly wearing boots worsened foot conditions. Feet became swollen, blistered, and raw from the lack of air. Others suggest soldiers simply rotated footwear if they were lucky. Was perpetual boot wear a universal misery or a burden mostly for the lower ranks? The evidence remains patchy. You wiggle your toes trying to coax some life back into them. You feel the hardened leather resist your every small movement. Your socks, which are just damp wool wraps, feel clammy and stiff. A pungent and sour stench wafts upward from your own feet. Everyone in the tent smells the same though, so no one ever bothers to complain about it. You press your boots closer to the fading warmth of the campfire. You hope the heat will soften the leather a little bit. Around you, other soldiers are doing the very same thing. Their boots crowd the edge of the embers like strange offerings. One man mutters that his heel feels completely black with cold. Another curses the painful blister on his arch. You settle back down, your boots still laced tight around your ankles. The stiff leather presses against your sore and aching skin, but you accept it because the choice is quite simple. A few hours of discomfort or true survival for another day. You let your eyes drift closed again. You understand why soldiers never truly rested their feet. They carried their survival with them step by step. Your breath fogs in the tense, stale air. You reach for the small flask at your side. The liquid inside sloshes quietly heavy with a simple promise. You tip it back and feel a welcome burn. This feeling spreads down your throat. It chases away the worst of the shivers for a moment. Ale, mead, or something harsher, it does not matter now. In this deep and bitter cold, soldiers simply call it medicine. For a few blissful minutes, you almost believe them. One historical fact is that alcohol was a staple in medieval camps. It was issued not just for simple cheer, but for grim necessity. Wine diluted with water or weak ale was often safer than drinking from an unclean stream or a questionable pond on the march. On freezing nights, soldiers turned to it as a crude antifreeze. The drink numbed both the body and the mind just enough to let a fitful and uneasy sleep finally take hold. Chroniclers often described men fortifying their hearts with drink. This was a polite phrase for gulping down liquid warmth. They did this right before collapsing into the darkness of their tents. Now for a very quirky tidbit from the past. Some soldiers believed that strong drink actually prevented frostbite. They claimed it magically warmed the blood from the inside. They would rub spirits on their skin or even soak socks in ale. They were truly convinced the alcohol acted like a shield. Picture the absurdity of staggering into your tent with beer-soaked socks. Yet historians still wrestle with the true role alcohol really played. Some argue it genuinely helped a soldier's fragile morale. It kept a crushing despair at bay during long, brutal campaigns. Others note that drunkenness left entire camps dangerously vulnerable. Men became too sluggish to respond to sudden attacks or spreading fires. Was it a boon for survival or a hidden liability? You lower the flask, your lips still tingling from the drink's raw bite. The warmth from the ale spreads very unevenly through your body. Your chest glows, but your fingers remain uncomfortably stiff. Your toes are still frozen solid in their leather boots. Around you, other men drink too. The soft glug of flasks punctuates the darkness. The air fills with the sour scent of yeast. But there is a great danger hidden in this comfort. You know that if you drink too much, your body will slacken, your vigilance will fade, and the precious fire outside could die. More than one campaign has recorded tents that were set ablaze. This happened because men passed out with flasks still in hand. Embers fell where they should not have. You lean back against the canvas wall. The drink hums softly in your veins as your eyelids grow heavier. The relentless cold feels less sharp now, as though someone has carefully dulled its edges with a knife. You know this warmth is false, but you cling to the comfort. You curl into your cloak, the flask tucked safely against your chest. For now, the ale has done its job. The itch is what wakes you before the cold does. At first, it is just a little tickle at your neck, something you scratch while you are still half asleep. But then the feeling begins to spread. A crawling irritation at your scalp and a pinch behind your knee. The unmistakable bite at your waist where cloth meets your skin. You groan softly in the darkness. You drag your sharp nails across the rough fabric of your tunic. You know exactly what has joined you in this cramped tent. The unwelcome and ever-present companion of the common soldier, lice. They thrive in the seams of your clothing. They feast in the warmth of your huddled body. One plain historical fact is that soldiers lived with lice. They were as constant as their cloaks and their swords. Chroniclers of the Crusades described armies so infested with them, men joked their camp companions were as loyal as their brothers in arms. Clothing was rarely washed, and water was always scarce. The packed tents were a perfect breeding ground. Here is a quirky detail you cannot quite laugh at. Some soldiers actually gave their lice names. Imagine sitting by a fire, scratching at your dirty shirt, and declaring that the fat little parasite you just picked off is Henry. It was a form of gallows humor, a strange way to cope with the endless crawling and biting that never truly stopped. But historians still argue about just how devastating lice really were. Some say the infestations were a mere nuisance, unpleasant to be sure, but ultimately survivable. Others point to the rapid spread of deadly diseases like typhus. These were carried by lice and could decimate entire camps. Were lice just itchy bedfellows, or were they silent killers in the wool? You shift on your cloak, your fingers digging deep under your collar. The fabric is rough with old grit and dried sweat. But beneath it, you can feel the tiny, hard bumps, the places where lice cling stubbornly to the seams. You pinch one and roll it between your fingertips. You wipe your hand on the frozen ground. Around you, other men do the same thing, scratching and muttering. Picture the sheer misery of this situation more closely. A man wriggling against the cold ground as if fighting an invisible foe. Another lifts his stained shirt toward the faint firelight. He squints as he searches for the pale specks clinging like seeds. A third soldier shakes out his woolen hood. He sends a little shower of lice, scattering like fine grains of sand. You sigh with a deep sense of resignation. You tuck yourself deeper into your itchy cloak, even though you know it only traps the pests closer to your skin. The constant itch will not let you rest easily tonight, but your exhaustion will eventually win over the discomfort. The crawling becomes part of the background hum of camp life. Even parasites were part of a soldier's survival. The scratching eventually fades into the background. You soon hear a completely different set of sounds. You hear low voices and muffled footsteps outside. The quiet shift of armor echoes in the darkness. You realize it is not just your tent that is alive. The entire camp itself never truly sleeps at all. There is always someone who must be awake. Someone always has to be watching the precious fire, watching the dark horizon for any sign of movement, watching for the flicker of an enemy torch in the distance. This is the constant rhythm of the guard rotation. You are a part of it, whether you want to be or not. Sleep comes in broken pieces, determined by duty, not by your own exhaustion. One firm historical fact is that armies divided the night into watches. They assigned men to stay awake in turns, while others slept. The number of watches varied, sometimes 3 or sometimes 4. Chroniclers mentioned the first watch and the dreaded last watch. The last watch meant dragging yourself into the coldest hours before dawn. Without these rotations, a camp could be taken by surprise. And here is a quirky tidbit about this duty. Guards often carried not just their weapons, but little wooden clappers. These devices were meant to scare away intruders, or simply to keep the guards themselves from dozing off. Imagine trudging around a frozen camp in the dark, stamping your boots and occasionally banging 2 sticks together, just so your heavy eyelids do not betray you. But historians still argue over just how strict these watches really were. Some accounts describe a system of iron discipline. Men were punished severely for sleeping while on their duty. Others suggest the rotations were often quite lax. Guards would nod off, relying on dogs or sheer luck. Was guard duty a hardened system, or just a fragile hope that someone would be awake? Imagine yourself now roused from your half-sleep. You stumble out of the tent with your cloak pulled tight. The air outside slaps your face, feeling sharp and icy. Your breath bursts into the night like a puff of smoke. The camp's fire has burned very low. Embers glow faintly, sending up just enough light to make the shadows of the tents dance. You take up your spear, its metal and wood, feeling colder than ice. You begin the slow and lonely patrol around the camp's perimeter. The frozen ground crunches loudly beneath your heavy boots. Every few steps you pause to listen intently, straining to hear beyond the constant groan of the wind. Somewhere, a horse stamps its hoof and whickers softly. Eventually, another soldier arrives to relieve you. You hand him the spear and mutter something about the fire. Then you slip back inside your own tent. The relative warmth feels like stepping into a steaming bath. You realize that the guard rotation is not just about watching for enemies. It is about keeping the entire camp breathing through the darkness until the morning comes. You do not remember falling back asleep after your turn on watch, but you do remember the constant presence of the voices. They weave in and out of your half-dreams like a strange lullaby. A man to your left hums a fragment of an old song. The words are lost, but the low tune buzzes through the tent's canvas walls. Another soldier whispers a quiet prayer in the dark. He mutters the same short phrase over and over again. The sound blends into the steady rhythm of your own breathing. It is a strange and unexpected comfort in the gloom. You are never truly alone in this tent, not even when your weary eyes are closed tight against the night. One straightforward historical fact is that soldiers often sang together. They did this both to pass the time and to raise their morale. Chronicles from campaigns in France describe men gathering around fires. They would chant psalms or bawdy ballads depending on their mood. These songs were a shield against despair, a way to rise above the crushing cold. And here is a quirky tidbit for you to consider. Soldiers sometimes mumbled their way into sleep by reciting food recipes. It was a kind of culinary lullaby for the starving man. Imagine lying on frozen ground, hearing your tentmate whisper. He whispers about roasting geese or thick stews. The absurdity of it kept men chuckling long enough to forget their misery. And still scholars debate what role this nightly chatter truly played. Some argue it was a conscious attempt to build strong solidarity. It created bonds through shared stories and familiar songs. Others suggest it was simply nervous noise, a way of drowning out the silence that reminded men of death. Was it a sign of fellowship, or was it a sign of fear? You turn in your cloak, listening as the sounds swell and fade. A loud snore joins the chorus, heavy and guttural, while another voice whispers a sad love song so quietly, you cannot tell if it is meant for the group, or if it is only for his own fading memory. The sacred and the profane share the same small space without any conflict. You realize that inside this thin-walled shelter, the voices are another kind of insulation. They do not provide any physical warmth, but they create a fragile psychological heat that keeps despair away. Every sound proves that life still pulses here, that men still breathe and dream despite the biting cold. To a stranger, it might sound like chaos, but to you it is a blanket. You close your eyes tighter, letting the strange symphony carry you. The hum of a half-remembered hymn drifts through the air. It mixes with the low chuckle of a joke from a dark corner. You understand this is how soldiers carved out a space for themselves. They could not chase the cold away, but they could fill the silence. The voices wove a net strong enough to hold back the darkness. You blink, awake, in the middle of the night. You realize, with a dull kind of clarity, your sleep has been broken. First, you fell into a heavy and deep slumber, lulled by the fire's fading glow and the murmur of voices. Now, only a few hours later, you find yourself wide awake, staring at the dim canvas ceiling of the tent. It feels strange, this natural interruption of your rest, as if your sleep for the night has been split neatly down the middle. One straightforward historical fact is that this was common. Scholars of pre-industrial life call it first sleep and second sleep. People would sleep for a few hours and then wake naturally. They would talk, pray, or tend fires before returning to their rest. Soldiers in their tents experienced this same strange rhythm. For them it was shaped less by personal choice and more by necessity. The biting cold, the constant noise, and the demands of watch duty, all of these things carved their nights into distinct chunks. There was no single long stretch of uninterrupted rest, not in this place of constant hardship. Here is a quirky tidbit about this midnight waking. Some men claimed this was the perfect time for eerie storytelling. They would share tales of ghosts and strange omens in the gloom. Imagine lying in a smoky tent, half awake. Your neighbor whispers about spirits that wander old battlefields, or about dead men who knock on tent walls in the deep darkness. And yet, historians still argue about whether segmented sleep was truly restful. Some say it was a perfectly natural human sleep cycle. The body was simply attuned to the rhythms of firelight. Others suggest it left soldiers perpetually and dangerously exhausted. unable to recover fully before dawn forced them to march. Was it adaptive, or just another cruelty of war? You shift in your cloak, listening to the sounds around you. Other men are also stirring in this strange waking period. Someone is praying softly, his words tumbling out in Latin. The man closest to you sighs and whispers about food. He speaks of fresh bread and roasted meat, anything but the stale crusts that truly await him in the cold morning. You realize this is a liminal and quiet time. A pause in the grinding routine of being a soldier. A time when men are neither fully awake nor fully asleep. Perhaps this is when secrets are confessed in low whispers. Men might speak of the families they left far behind, or of the deep fears they would never admit in the harsh light of day. Eventually, the strange rhythm of the night shifts again. The voices fade, and the movements inside the tent begin to slow. Men roll back into their cloaks, pulling their hoods over their heads, and gradually the snores return, one by one, until the tent hums. You feel your own eyelids droop. You surrender to slumber, trusting the second sleep will be enough to carry you to the dawn. You wake again, not to a sound, but to a simple sight. In the dim light, you notice something that never fails to sting. Not all of the cloaks and bedding here are created equal. The man across from you, a knight's retainer, shifts in his sleep. He is wrapped in thick wool, layered with soft fur. You lie on a rough hide that still smells faintly of goat. Rank does not simply vanish here in the dark. It curls up beside the fortunate and snores in great comfort, while you and the other common men shiver with the endless cold. One clear historical fact is that gear varied enormously. It varied between the high-ranking knights and the common foot soldiers. Wealthier men could afford lined cloaks or even feather-stuffed pallets. Chronicles from the period described nobles sleeping beneath embroidered pavilions. Their tents often had rugs and fine pillows carted along by servants. Meanwhile, the rank-and-file soldiers had little more than their own cloaks, some straw, and perhaps a single blanket shared between 3 men. Comfort was just another stark privilege of a man's social class. Here is a quirky tidbit about this very disparity. During some campaigns, knights insisted on bringing brightly colored bedding, red, blue, or even patterned with their proud family crests. It was not just for comfort, but for pure display. Imagine staggering half-dead from cold into a tent, and seeing it glowing with silks as if it were a festival pavilion. But historians still debate how wide this gulf in comfort truly was. Some argue a knight's tent was a genuine sanctuary of warmth, while the foot soldiers barely survived the night in their cold shelters. Others suggest the gap was not always so vast. Supply shortages often reduced even nobles to rough improvisations. The evidence is often muddied by the bias of who did the writing. You glance again at your tentmates' expensive furs. You feel a familiar mix of envy and weary resignation. The fur glistens faintly in the firelight leaking through the flap. Your own smelly cloak is a dull and matted brown. Even the smells in the tent mark this divide. His bedding carries a faint scent of herbs from a sachet. Yours reeks of sweat, grease, and stale ale. Picture the entire camp as the pale dawn approaches. The pavilions of nobles stand tall and are richly dyed. The straw-stuffed lean-tos of the soldiers are sagging nearby. The contrast is stark and almost grotesque to behold. It looks like a village where a carnival tent rose beside a hovel War pressed all classes into the same mud, but never on the very same terms. You roll over, pulling your own rough cloak tighter. You remind yourself that survival is not measured by softness. Comfort does not guarantee a man's endurance through hardship. Sometimes the man with fewer blankets learns faster how to huddle, how to endure, and how to cling to scraps of warmth. The night may dream in fur, but you dream in pure persistence. The main fire outside has sunk low again into ash. When you next wake, it is to a faint but steady glow. But something else now catches your eye from inside the tent. A strange pot is squatting by the entrance flap. It is a clay vessel, smudged completely black from repeated use. A faint and welcome warmth leaks gently from its sides. Someone has carefully carried hot coals from the fire inside. They have banked them in this small brazier to keep the chill away. A reliable historical fact is that soldiers sometimes used these stoves. Clay pots or metal braziers were filled with coals. Archaeological digs in Europe have uncovered scorched potsherds in camp layers. This is the evidence of these makeshift heaters. Chroniclers of the period also mention them. They describe vessels of fire carried carefully into shelters. The coals would smolder for hours beside the weary, sleeping men. They were incredibly risky as a source of indoor heat, but they offered something even a thick cloak could not. They offered a steady and continuous warmth against the long and bitter night. Here is a quirky tidbit about this dangerous practice. Soldiers sometimes dropped herbs or pine needles into the embers. This was not just for the faint and pleasant aroma. It was also meant to keep away the biting insects that plagued them. Imagine the strange irony of lying half-frozen, inhaling the scent of smoldering rosemary, while still scratching at the endless lice in your tunic. But historians still argue whether these braziers were common or rare. Some claim only officers could afford such dangerous contraptions, while ordinary men relied solely on their own shared body heat. Others point to evidence that even humble camps produced countless pots, suggesting they were widespread improvisations. Was it a privilege of rank, or simply the invention of desperate men? You inch yourself closer to the glowing pot in the darkness. You stretch your hands out toward its gentle, radiating warmth. The heat is not very strong, but in the drafty tent it feels miraculous. Your cold palms tingle, and your face begins to soften. For a brief moment, the worst of the cold finally retreats, but the thin smoke from the pot stings your throat and makes your eyes water. Picture the tent in this moment of dangerous comfort. Men are crouched around the tiny, glowing brazier, like monks around a relic. The hot coals glow a deep and mesmerizing red in the gloom. Their faces are lit eerily from below, making them look like ghosts. Shadows twist and stretch across the rough canvas walls. It feels both holy and terribly dangerous at the same time. As you lie back again with your cloak wrapped tight, you feel the warmth radiating across the small space. It is not enough to banish the cold entirely, but it blunts its teeth. The pot of coals sits steady by the tent's entrance, a guardian and a threat all in one. You realize this was the paradox of medieval survival. Every comfort always carried its own dark shadow. You wake again, stiff in every single joint. This time, you notice the way your body feels heavier. It is not just the oppressive cold pressing down on you. It is the sheer weight of the clothing you never fully take off. Your quilted gambeson lies wadded up beside you. You realize you have been using it as a crude mattress. This padded armor is now a makeshift cushion. It serves to dull the unrelenting hardness of the frozen earth. One straightforward historical fact is that soldiers frequently did this. A gambeson was more than just simple battlefield protection. It was a thick, quilted garment stuffed with layers of linen or wool. It could weigh as much as 20 pounds. Stripped from the body at night, this armor padding doubled as a mattress, or sometimes it was used as an extra blanket against the chill. Some chronicles even describe knights propping their steel helmets. They would place them under their heads like lumpy, uncomfortable pillows. They transformed the tools of war into fragile and inadequate comforts. Here is a quirky tidbit from the life of a soldier. Soldiers sometimes joked that their gambeson was warmer dead than alive. What they meant was that lying on it felt far better than wearing it during a long and sweaty march. On the march, it trapped heat and sweat like a furnace. But laid flat, it became an almost luxurious padding. And yet, historians still argue about just how practical this was. Some suggest that gambesons offered genuine and useful insulation, thick enough to shield men from the worst of the frost and damp. Others counter that, once they were sweat-soaked and stiff, they provided little more than a simple barrier against the thick mud. Was it a lifesaver or just another damp rag? You lie back now, feeling the uneven quilting under your spine. Some spots bulge with padding, while other spots sag. But compared to the bare ground, it feels almost like paradise. The damp chill of the earth still seeps slowly upward, but at least your bones do not grind against the frozen soil. The fabric reeks of endurance and days of hard labor. Around you in the gloom, other men are doing the same. One man lies with his gambeson pulled half over him. Another sprawls directly on top of his hard breastplate. One young soldier curls with his helmet against his chest, as if he were hugging a cold and unloving child. You can hear the faint scrape of metal whenever someone shifts in their sleep. Picture the entire scene more clearly now. Gambesons are spread like patchwork mattresses with their seams torn. Helmets glint faintly in the dim light of the dying embers. The entire tent looks like a jumble of repurposed war gear. As you let your body sink into this strange mattress, you realize the deep irony. Everything designed to harm becomes a tool for survival. You wake with a start, your nose wrinkling before your eyes even open. It is not the biting cold this time, it is the overwhelming smell. A tent packed with tired men is never fragrant. But after nights of smoke, sweat, and damp wool, the odor has become its own living thing. You breathe in cautiously, and it clings to your lungs. The air is thick with a complex mixture of scents. Sharp, acrid smoke from the half-burned wood outside. The sour smell of sweat soaked deep into every cloak. The wet dog scent of damp wool that never truly dries. And underneath it all is the faint but undeniable temps of something singed, as if the evening stew pot boiled over and scorched. One firm historical fact is that medieval camps reeked. Chroniclers often mention the terrible stench of these places. Fires burned constantly, soaking canvas and clothing in smoke. Tents trapped all the moisture, turning wool into mildewed sponges. Add in the fact that soldiers rarely bathed on campaign, and you begin to understand why the smell of camp was so infamous. Here is a quirky tidbit about these foul odors. Some commanders ordered herbs scattered on the tent floors to mask the smell. Soldiers would crush lavender, rosemary, or thyme beneath their boots. They pretended it freshened the stale air for a moment. Some men even carried little pouches of dried herbs around their necks, a desperate attempt to breathe something other than smoke. Yet historians still puzzle over how much the stench truly mattered. Some argue it was so constant that soldiers simply stopped noticing. Their noses became numb after weeks of living in the foulness. Others suggest it carried very real and dangerous consequences, spreading disease by attracting flies and fouling the air. Was it just unpleasant, or was it another invisible enemy? You shift uncomfortably in your spot. You tug the fabric of your cloak closer to your face. But the terrible smell only intensifies as you do. The wool is damp with your own sweat and smoke. It feels rough and greasy against your cheek as you breathe. You cough softly, your throat feeling raw from inhaling the stale air all night. You think of your home for a fleeting moment. You remember the smell of fresh rushes strewn on clean floors, the scent of sheets washed in cold, clear river water. The memory stings you sharper than the stench itself. Around you, other men groan as they wake. Their voices are thick and hoarse from breathing the same heavy air. Yet, strangely, the smell also becomes part of the rhythm. It tells you that you are still alive in this place, that the men around you are still breathing and still sweating. The reek is unpleasant, yes, but silence and clean air would mean worse. It would mean an empty and abandoned tent. You breathe in again and accept the foulness like another layer of armor. You are half asleep when you first hear it. A soft and steady tapping sound on the canvas walls. It is like hundreds of tiny fingers drumming against the fabric. Then comes the unmistakable chill seeping through the tent's seams. Rain, or worse, melting snow, has found every single gap. It is now dripping onto faces already weary from the deep cold. The tent, which at times feels like a fragile refuge, it now becomes its own kind of enemy. It funnels the worst of the storm directly inside. You roll over and feel a single drop splash against your cheek. It is icy enough to jolt you fully upright in the dark. The steady rhythm of drips begins to fill the small space around you with a miserable sound. From surviving accounts, we know that medieval tents were notoriously leaky. Heavy canvas and linen offered some modest shade and shelter. But once saturated with rain or snow, the fibers sagged. Chronicles describe soldiers waking up in literal puddles of water. Their cloaks were soaked and their straw bedding was completely ruined overnight. There is also an odd custom worth mentioning here. Some soldiers tried to waterproof their tents. They used crude mixtures of animal fat or sticky tar. The result was not perfect, as water still seeped in, but it left the canvas greasy to the touch. It also smelled faintly of rancid lard. You would duck inside, only to be greeted by slick and sticky fabric. Interpretations differ on how soldiers truly endured prolonged downpours. Some historians suggest they rotated their bedding constantly, sending men out to cut new straw to replace what had turned to mush. Others argue the misery simply had to be tolerated. Men slept wet, woke shivering, and marched on in sodden gear. Was there any effective system for keeping dry? You curl tighter under your heavy woolen cloak, but the insidious wet sneaks in anyway. The wool holds some warmth even when it is damp, but it clings to your skin with a cold and clammy grip. The ground beneath you has become a soft mud. It oozes upward as though the earth itself is trying to swallow you whole in the night. The sounds in the tent are now dominated by the storm. The The constant drip, drip, drip of water is a rhythm of pure discomfort. The fire outside hisses as the rain spits onto the hot embers. The smell of wet wool carries a sour barnyard scent. The leather of your boots grows sharp and pungent when it is soaked. Yet there is something strangely unifying in this shared misery. Men who moments before grumbled at each other now laugh grimly. One soldier jokes that he will grow gills by the morning. Another swears the water dripping onto his head is a holy baptism. Humor becomes its own kind of blanket, covering the damp bodies with a fragile and temporary warmth. The storm finally passes, but the night never feels entirely safe. You lie there listening to the rain fade into a deep silence, only for another sound to take its place. A faint clinking, like small charms brushing against one another. You lift your head and notice the strange shapes. They are dangling from the central tent pole in the darkness. They are not mere decorations to brighten the gloomy space. You see little pouches and small wooden crosses. Even animal bones are tied with a simple string. These are defenses of another kind entirely, woven not from wool or wood or any physical thing, but woven from the powerful and invisible fabric of pure belief. Contemporary writings remind us that superstitions seeped into soldiering, and the vulnerable hours of sleep were no exception to this. Men pinned protective amulets inside the folds of their cloaks. They hung these charms on tent ropes, hoping to keep evil away. Some men clutched tiny relics no bigger than a splinter, believing it was a fragment from some holy shrine. And then there were the stranger and more peculiar habits. Soldiers in Eastern Europe sometimes tied small animal skulls to their tents. They were convinced these grim trophies warded off frost demons. Others sprinkled what passed for holy water around the tent's edge. It was like an invisible fence against the spirits of the night, a fragile barrier made of faith. The scholarly debate still lingers over how to interpret this. Was this true religious practice or simple folk superstition? Some experts insist the charms reflected a sincere and deep devotion. Others argue it was more instinct than any kind of doctrine. Primitive gestures made against a powerful and constant fear. Were they protecting their souls or just distracting themselves? You stretch out your hand in the darkness. You touch the charm that is dangling closest to you. It is a scrap of cloth tied into a tight knot. It feels stiff with grease, and it smells faintly of wood smoke. Maybe it once held dried herbs or a token from a wife. Now it is a simple talisman in this cold and wet camp. Around you men whisper things in their half-sleep. Their prayers are tumbling together with their tired curses. One soldier crosses himself repeatedly, muttering the names of saints. Another strokes a small wooden token, his thumb rubbing it smooth with habit. The tent becomes a strange chapel of sorts. Its congregation is sprawled on the damp and muddy ground. You close your eyes again, your hands still brushing the little knot of cloth. Perhaps this small charm does absolutely nothing at all. Perhaps it holds no real power against the cold. But belief itself is a kind of power, and in the dark night, when everything else feels hostile, even a scrap of superstition can feel like a sturdy shield. You wake to the feeling of something warm pressing against your side. It is not another soldier this time, but something much softer, something furrier. You turn your body slightly in the darkness. You find the camp dog curled tightly against your back. Its wet nose is tucked into its tail. Its warm breath puffs out in quiet little huffs. The animal has crept into the tent during the cold night. It has chosen your small corner as its personal refuge. For a moment, the worst of the cold seems to fade away, and all you can feel is the steady pulse of heat, the warmth radiating from its small and living body. It is a simple bargain of shared survival. Chroniclers often note that animals wandered freely through medieval camps, and dogs were the most common of these companions. They scavenged for scraps and guarded precious supplies. On cold nights, these animals were not shooed away. They were welcomed into the tents. They shared their warmth, becoming living heaters on four legs. And here is a curious glimpse from the margins of history. Some soldiers gave their dogs honorary roles in camp life. They called them mascots or special guardians of the company. One source from a Burgundian campaign tells of a mutt nicknamed Captain, who slept in the commander's tent and barked loudly enough to rouse the men. Yet experts remain divided on whether this bond was common or exceptional. Some argue that dogs were everywhere in these camps. They were indispensable companions to the lonely soldiers. Others suggest their true role was often exaggerated, that the animals were more of a nuisance than an actual aid, spreading fleas and stealing the men's scarce food rations. You stroke the dog's fur, feeling its coarse yet comforting texture. It smells faintly of wood smoke and old meat scraps, like everything else, but its undeniable warmth is a welcome gift. You can feel the steady and rapid thump of its heartbeat. Faster than your own, it is as steady as a quiet drum. The dog sighs deeply and presses even closer. Around you in the gloom, other men begin to notice. One grumbles with a hint of jealousy in his low voice, muttering that you have stolen the best blanket in the entire camp. Another soldier chuckles softly in the darkness. He calls the dog wiser than most men for finding the warmest spot. The dog becomes a bridge, uniting tired men in shared amusement. You close your eyes, again your hand resting on the dog's flank. You feel its chest rise and fall with each quiet breath. Its life-giving warmth seeps slowly into your own bones. Perhaps it is no great miracle, just simple body heat. But in the middle of a freezing campaign, it feels miraculous. You drift back into a deeper and more peaceful sleep. Morning never seems to come quickly enough. But tonight, you find yourself awake, not from the cold or an itch. You wake from a profound and sudden silence. The dog has shifted away from your side. The fire outside has sunk very low, and within the tent the usual chorus of mutters and snores has faded. There is only a heavy stillness. The silence is broken now and again by the snap of the canvas, as a gust of wind claws at the tent ropes. It takes you a moment to realize the simple reason why. The commanders have ordered the camp to be quiet. No songs, no idle chatter, no prayers muttered too loudly, just a blanket of silence, heavy and deliberate. Documents from military ordinances show us this was common. Camp discipline often extended even into the dead of night. Soldiers were warned against making any unnecessary noise. This was not only to keep a sense of order, but also to prevent enemy scouts from detecting the camp's position. A rowdy camp could betray its location from miles away. And yet, some odd exceptions to this rule did exist. Some armies developed their own codes of whispered signals, clicks of the tongue, or small knocks against a shield. These let men communicate without raising their voices at all. Imagine lying awake and hearing not a single word. but the faint tap-tap that meant the watch was all clear. Interpretations vary over how strictly such rules were ever followed. Some historians argue that commanders enforced the silence with brutal punishments. They would lash men who laughed too loudly after dark. Others believe that soldiers often ignored the order, at least when they were far from any known enemy lines. Was this hush universal or just an ideal? You lie there now listening to the very absence of sound. No snoring, no coughing, and no whispered songs fill the air. The tent feels different without them, almost eerie and unsettling. Your own heartbeat becomes loud in your ears, like a steady drum. The dog stirs quietly, its tail brushing the ground, and even that feels like a shout in the stillness. Your other senses seem to sharpen, to fill the void. The smell of smoke lingers like a thick, invisible blanket. The dampness of the wool clings sharp and earthy to your nostrils. Leather gives off its own sour temps in the enclosed space. In the absence of voices, your mind focuses on these odors, as if the tent wants to remind you that silence cannot erase discomfort. You feel a strange power in this imposed quiet. You sense the discipline binding you and the other men together, invisible but as strong as any iron chain. In silence, men learn to endure not just the cold, but also the unnerving stillness of the night. It is a different kind of survival, not by warmth, but by sheer restraint. Dawn creeps slowly across the frozen horizon. It brings very little warmth with its pale light. The dog has slipped away to scavenge for scraps, and you notice something different in the tent. A single blanket of mismatched colors is spread across to men. Its weave is much finer than anything you have ever seen in a camp. At first, you think it is their own personal item. But no, its dyes are deeper and the fabric looks softer. Then you realize exactly what it must be. It is spoils of war. Someone has looted it from a nearby village, or perhaps from a captured nobleman's baggage train. War provides its own strange and often violent comforts. Chronicles from campaigns repeatedly mention this practice. Soldiers scavenged bedding and blankets from the towns they conquered. Pillows, quilts, and even fine rugs were taken from homes. They ended up in muddy tents draped across weary bodies. These men cared nothing for the origins of their newfound warmth, only that it worked. And sometimes the results of this plunder were almost laughable. Men slept beneath embroidered hangings meant for a church altar, or they wrapped themselves in heavy curtains hastily cut from a lord's hall. Imagine curling up under a cloth once blessed for a holy mass. Now it stinks of smoke and sweat in a common soldier's tent. Modern historians still disagree on how widespread this practice was. Some argue it was very common, because armies relied heavily on plunder for their essential supplies. Others caution that the chroniclers often exaggerated these stories, focusing on gaudy tales of silk, while most soldiers still froze. Was looted bedding an everyday sight or a rare stroke of luck? You shift in your spot and run your hand along the blanket's edge. It feels smoother than your own rough cloak. The threads are tight and the color is still vibrant. The men sharing it sigh with relief in their deep sleep. Their faces look younger, as if comfort has peeled away a few years. The blanket carries a faint sweetness, a memory of lavender from another life. Picture the tent now as a patchwork of sheer survival. One man is wrapped in some looted velvet. Another is curled on a rough and smelly animal pelt. Another shivers beneath only his thin military cloak. The fine blanket stands out like a single jewel dropped in the mud, a bright reminder of plunder's strange role in keeping armies moving through the winter. You close your eyes again, imagining how many soldiers before you did this, slept under someone else's stolen treasure. Curtains, rugs, and altar cloths, all torn from their rightful places. They became simple bedding in the dark, cold night. War does not just take lives from people. It also steals their comfort and completely transforms it. The stolen blanket does not reach your corner of the tent, so you shift back onto your own bed of simple straw. It crackles faintly underneath you as you move, the dry stalks snapping beneath your considerable weight. The sound is strangely reassuring in the quiet gloom. At least it means the straw has not yet grown damp from the mud. You run your hand across the bedding. You feel the rough ends of the stalks prick your skin, and you realize that for all of its scratchiness, it is so much better than lying directly on the frozen ground. Records from medieval armies make it clear that straw was standard. It was a common form of bedding whenever it was available to the men. Bundles of it were cut from any nearby fields. They were hauled into the tents and spread beneath the cloaks. This served as a crude but effective form of insulation. Chroniclers note that during long and cold sieges, entire wagon loads of straw were requisitioned. They were brought in specifically for the soldiers' bedding and nothing else. And yet there were some creative twists to its use. Some soldiers stuffed the dry straw into large sacks. They would sew the top shut to make rough, lumpy mattresses. Others scattered rushes or dried reeds among the straw, layering them carefully so the sharp ends pointed downward. Some even used pine needles because they released a pleasant scent. Specialists still debate how effective this straw truly was. Some argue it provided excellent insulation if it was replaced often. It trapped pockets of warm air between all the stalks. Others point out that once straw became damp, it was useless. It would begin to mold quickly and attract all sorts of vermin. Was straw a genuine comfort or just a temporary illusion? You stretch out your legs and feel the uneven padding beneath you. Some of the sharp stalks poke you uncomfortably. Other spots seem to cushion your aching joints. The texture shifts constantly and is never truly soft, but it is just enough to dull the persistent ache from the earth. The smell of the straw is dry, dusty, and faintly sweet. It mingles with the harsher odors inside the tent, until for a brief moment the shelter smells almost like a warm barn. Picture the tent's interior carefully in your mind. Cloaks are sprawled on uneven piles of the golden straw. Bits of it cling to the men's clothing and beards. It leaves them looking as though they have sprouted dry whiskers overnight. You curl onto your side, your cheek pressed against the brittle stalks. They scratch your skin, but they also support your head, keeping your face from touching the cold, wet mud below. You sigh, grateful for even this thin and simple barrier. Straw is not a luxury by any possible measure, but in this world enough is the closest thing you will ever find to comfort. Morning comes harshly to the medieval camp. It does not arrive with warmth, but with a deeper kind of cold, a chill that seems to have crept into your very bones while you slept. You open your eyes and see your own breath. It is clouding before you like smoke from a dying fire. The pale light of dawn offers no comfort at all. The tent walls around you are stiff with a layer of frost. The canvas crackles faintly when you happen to touch it. Each seam is now outlined in delicate white crystals. You shift your heavy cloak and realize it too has frozen, where it absorbed last night's damp. It is now as stiff as a wooden plank, bending reluctantly as you try to move. Sources from winter campaigns tell us this was a terrible ordeal. Chroniclers describe tents coated in thick rime. Ropes would snap when pulled to taut in the cold. Armor often had to be pried apart before it could be worn. Even the horses stood coated in a layer of frost, their hot breath rising like steam in the pale and watery dawn. And there are stranger accounts, almost humorous, if they were not so miserable. Men sometimes woke to find their beards frozen into their cloaks, locked in place by thousands of tiny ice crystals. Others discovered their boots were stiff enough to stand upright. They stood without any feet inside, transformed overnight into grotesque leather statues. Scholarly opinions still diverge on how much these conditions crippled armies. Some argue that entire campaigns simply stalled in the deep winter. The frost made the armor unusable and the roads completely impossible. Others suggest soldiers just endured the hardship. Their movements were slower, but they were still relentless. Was a frozen morning catastrophic, or just another misery? You sit up very slowly, your cloak crackling as you pull it from your shoulders. Your fingers ache, feeling stiff and clumsy. You fumble with the frozen ties of your woolen tunic. Around you the tent stirs with low groans and muttered curses. One man shakes his straw bedding, sending up a faint shower of frost. Another rubs his hands furiously, trying to warm them. You picture yourself crawling toward the open tent flap. Outside the ground gleams a bright silver. Every blade of grass is rimmed in a perfect frost. Armor lies scattered like discarded shells, glazed with a thin layer of ice. The metal is so cold that it seems to bite your skin. Men crouch low to coax the dying embers back to life. Yet even in this shared misery, life somehow continues. Someone manages a weak joke about statues coming to life. A ripple of faint laughter passes through the shivering men. The cold steals words as surely as it steals all the heat. But these small moments prove that men can still laugh, even when their teeth are chattering violently in their heads. The frozen dawn has only just broken over the horizon. The harsh order to march comes quickly through the camp. You groan along with all the other men, dragging your stiff and unwilling body upright from the straw. You wrap your frozen cloak tightly around your shoulders. Then you step out into the brittle and biting air. Every movement you make feels like it belongs to someone else. Your joints feel like rusted hinges that have been forced shut. The ground crunches loudly under your every single footstep. Each step is a firm reminder that real warmth is still hours away, if it ever comes at all on a day like this. The grim routine of the army has begun again. Chroniclers repeatedly note that armies rarely enjoyed the luxury of resting. After a freezing night, soldiers were always expected to move. They had to lift their tired bodies and march onward with their armor clanking. There are descriptions of men barely able to bend their legs. They hobbled like old men as commanders barked them into columns. Survival meant constant motion. And then there is the stranger side of this daily routine. Accounts describe men deliberately rubbing handfuls of snow on their faces. They did this in order to shock themselves fully awake. The logic was both brutal and surprisingly effective. The sharp sting of ice on your cheeks forced your blood to flow. It jolted your body into reluctant but necessary motion. Experts still disagree about how soldiers truly managed these daily ordeals. Some argue the sheer rhythm of war dragged men into motion, with orders shouted and drums beating to keep a steady pace. Others claim soldiers often lagged far behind, straggling on frozen roads with commanders constantly berating them. Was morning discipline ironclad or ragged in its practice? You shoulder your heavy bundle, the weight pressing down on you. You join the endless shuffle of boots, leaving the now dead camp. The fires are left to smolder and turn into cold ash. The tents collapse behind you with the crackle of frozen canvas. The air smells sharper out here, filled with cold earth and smoke. Breath rises from hundreds of men at once, like a thick fog. The march feels completely endless as you look ahead. You see nothing but other cloaks hunched against the sharp wind. Spears are bobbing up and down like stalks of dead grass. Behind you, the same bleak sight stretches to the horizon. Occasionally, a man hums a tune off-key, but others join in, and the sound carries you forward. By the time the weak sun finally climbs into the sky, you have already walked for many long and painful hours. Your body no longer feels entirely like your own. Numb feet and aching shoulders are all that truly remain. But strangely, this numbness becomes its own kind of armor. You realize this is the secret, enduring not just the night, but the frozen morning after. By midday, the long march has carried you into a different landscape. The biting cold, however, clings stubbornly to your bones. You notice that not every army in the world faced the same kind of misery. Soldiers from the different corners of Europe brought their own unique traditions. Their own fabrics and winter gear were sometimes poorly suited to the climate. Lying in your tent again that night, you think about this. How survival must have looked very different depending on where you came from. Surviving records show us there were clear regional contrasts in equipment. In Northern Europe, for instance, thick wool dominated everything. It was used for heavy cloaks, layered hoods, and even crude mittens. Chroniclers in Flanders described men who were cocooned in wool. The fabric was so dense that melting snow slid from their shoulders. Meanwhile, soldiers from southern lands often struggled greatly. They struggled when they were forced into these harsh northern winters. Their lighter linen garments became a serious liability in the constant sleet and ice. And there were some peculiar improvisations worth remembering. Men from colder regions sometimes stuffed their boots with moss. It was a simple trick passed down for generations from shepherds. In contrast, Italians on campaign were noted for layering shirts. They built warmth not with outer cloaks, but with multiple thin fabrics. Imagine peeling off 5 damp linen shirts at dawn. Specialists today still disagree on whether these practices truly mattered. Some argue that cultural clothing gave soldiers a real advantage. Scots and Norsemen, they say, endured damp winters more easily. Others believe once men were on campaign, everyone suffered equally. Wet wool is wet wool, no matter what corner of Europe you came from. Did tradition really shape survival? You lie back and think about your own simple cloak. It is thick but itchy, and it smells of old smoke. You imagine other men under cloaks dyed bright red or green, or cloaks that were trimmed with some kind of soft fur. Some were heirlooms passed down through their families, their wearers believing the fabric carried the strength of their ancestors. The tent now fills with this variety, even among your own comrades. One soldier beside you wears a cloak patched with dark leather. Another man clings to a blanket striped with different colors. It was clearly woven in a different and faraway land. A third wraps himself in layers so thick he looks like a mound of cloth. The diversity of fabrics creates a patchwork inside the shelter. You close your eyes again, tugging your own familiar cloak tighter. You realize that your survival tonight is stitched not just from wool, but it is stitched from culture itself. You are warmed or frozen by the choices of weavers long ago. And though tomorrow you will march beside men from distant lands, tonight you are wrapped together in the patchwork quilt of Europe's fabrics. The frost has barely left the ground when you realize something. The next ordeal is far worse than an open march. You have arrived at a siege. The camp outside the city walls is no temporary stop. It is not the fleeting misery of 1 or 2 nights. It is weeks or even months of endless waiting in the cold. Here, the tent becomes less of a simple shelter and more of a muddy cage, trapping soldiers in a grim cycle. A cycle of smoke, wet earth, and suffocating boredom. Medieval chronicles tell us that sieges dragged on through bitter winters, forcing men to sleep in fields churned into a sea of mud and slush. Soldiers dug shallow trenches for their tents. They pitched their shelters on makeshift platforms of wood, and they prayed the canvas would somehow withstand the winter storms. Accounts from the siege of Turna describe entire rows of tents. They were collapsing under the weight of heavy snow. Men dragged themselves out, half frozen, only to crawl back beneath the sagging canvas. Some of the coping measures these men used bordered on the absurd. Soldiers at certain sieges built raised wooden pallets inside their tents. They would lay their cloaks and hides across them like crude bunk beds, anything to keep their bodies above the constantly flooded ground. Others spread straw so thick it piled up knee-high, only for it to rot into a swamp after days of rain. Researchers differ on how sustainable this siege living really was. Some argue that men endured it surprisingly well for a time. They were sustained by supply trains and large communal fires. Others insist that attrition from cold and filth was the true weapon, killing far more soldiers than enemy arrows ever could. Were the tents shelters or just symbols of routine? You picture yourself huddled in such a leaking tent, listening to the rain hammer, the canvas night after endless night. The ropes creak and the wooden poles begin to bow. Water seeps in, no matter how you try to patch the seams. Your cloak clings damply to your shoulders, and the straw beneath you has turned into a black and stinking sludge. The smells of the camp intensify until they are almost unbearable. Acrid smoke is caught beneath the low tent flap. Mold grows from the rotting straw beneath your body. Add to that the reek of unwashed men crammed into a small space, and you understand why men grew sick so very quickly. Coughs echo in the night like the drums of a coming disease. As you close your eyes again, listening to the wind howl, you realize that siege life was a battle with the elements. Every single night became an act of stubborn and grim resistance. To lie in a leaking tent and breathe the stink of rot, and still to wake and endure another gray day. Survival was measured in the sheer will to keep living. The cold that gnaws at you in the northern winters is one thing, but there is another different kind of cold that catches men by surprise. You might imagine a land of only sand and unrelenting heat. the glare of the sun baking the entire day into a long misery. This is the challenge of the desert campaign. When the darkness finally falls, the warmth completely vanishes. It is as if it was stolen by invisible hands in the sky. A deep chill sweeps over the camp. It feels sharper because of its contrast to the blistering hours before. Men who marched all day with sweat pouring down their backs now find themselves shivering violently under a brilliant canopy of stars. Accounts from crusading armies in the Levant describe this struggle, as do the chronicles of Moorish campaigns in southern Spain. Soldiers struggled with these brutal and sudden swings in temperature. Their cloaks were soaked with sweat during the day, but they hardened like stiff boards during the freezing nights. The dampness was trapped against their skin, and there were peculiar improvisations worth remembering from these campaigns. Soldiers often dug shallow pits in the sand to sleep in. They would lie inside and cover themselves with their cloaks, so the earth itself served as a form of good insulation. Others slept beneath their shields, turning the curved metal or wood into a makeshift roof against the cold wind. Scholars remain divided on whether these methods truly helped the men. Some point to the records of soldiers freezing to death. This is clear evidence that their improvisations often fell short. Others argue that the very survival of armies proves these tactics worked. They must have been at least somewhat effective to prevent disaster. Was it endurance, or was it just a nightly gamble? You imagine yourself lying in such a sandy tent. Its canvas is straining against hot winds that have suddenly turned icy. Sand creeps silently into every single seam of the shelter. It fills your boots and grinds between your teeth. The stars above seem endless and as sharp as frost. Their cold beauty is mocking your shivering and vulnerable body. The silence of the desert night is very different from northern winds. Here there is no rustle of trees or patter of falling rain, only a vast and deep emptiness broken by the occasional sound, the bark of a jackal or the cry of some unknown night bird. Every sound feels magnified, the hiss of a tent rope shifting, the soft pop of a coal refusing to die. Despite the misery, some laughter still trickles through the tents. One soldier jokes that he preferred the familiar snow of his home to this cursed land where you sweat and freeze in the same day. You pull your cloak tighter and tell yourself the dawn will come, the sun will rise again, and its heat will return. This cycle of extremes becomes its own harsh rhythm. The desert night finally leaves its mark on the men, as do the endless and damp northern winters. The body eventually begins to show the true price of these campaigns. You wake one morning and realize something is wrong. The cough you heard in the tent last week has not gone away. In fact, it has multiplied, infecting others. Men now hack and wheeze constantly in the darkness. Their chests are rattling as though gravel has been poured deep inside. You touch your own throat, feeling it is raw from the smoke and frost, and you understand that sickness is now as constant a companion, as constant as the very cloak upon your back. Surviving letters and chronicles reveal this grim truth. Disease became inseparable from the cold nights in the camp. Pneumonia fevers and frostbite spread faster than any wild arrows. Even a minor chill could easily turn deadly for the men. When they slept in damp and crowded conditions, night after endless night, the cold weakened bodies, and weakness invited sickness. And then there were the stranger details about this. the things that desperate soldiers did to try and cure themselves. Some drank warm ale that was mixed with crushed garlic. They swore that this foul concoction banished the chills. Others placed slices of onion inside their boots, convinced the fumes would travel upward to cleanse their sick lungs. Modern researchers are still divided on the impact of this illness. Just how devastating was this cold-induced sickness to the armies? Some argue it truly decimated the fighting forces, accounting for the majority of casualties in certain winter campaigns. Others suggest that hardened soldiers simply endured it better than we assume. Were camps truly graveyards of coughs, or did men exaggerate? You lie back and listen to the grim symphony of illness. A man on your left hacks violently into his sleeve. Another soldier groans, clutching his chest in pain. He whispers that his ribs now feel like sharp knives. Someone sneezes, a wet and explosive sound, and then he curses immediately after into the foul air. The smell in the tent has changed for the worse, too. Smoke and wool still dominate the heavy atmosphere, but beneath them now lies the sour tang of sickness, the faint metallic scent of blood from lips cracked by fever. You inhale reluctantly, each breath catching in your own chest. The tent feels smaller, as though the illness itself has thickened the air. You wrap your cloak tighter around your body. You press it against your mouth as if it could filter the air. Your own chest aches with each breath, but you tell yourself something. You say it is just the smoke and not the sickness. You realize the true battle was never just about keeping warm. It was about keeping illness at bay long enough to see another dawn. The sounds of coughing do not fade entirely away, but a deep sleep still drags you under its surface. And there, in the quiet darkness, you find yourself dreaming. You are dreaming of a profound and welcome warmth, not the real warmth of a fire or a cloak, but the powerful and vivid memory of it from a lifelong past. You dream of the way a hearth once glowed brightly at your home, the comforting smell of fresh bread baking in an oven, the soft and heavy weight of a real feather mattress. You wake for just a moment and realize how cruel the mind can be. It gives you this perfect comfort in dreams, only to snatch it away when your eyes open to the damp tent. Writings from medieval soldiers often mentioned these dreams, as did the men who chronicled their long and difficult campaigns. Some men claimed they dreamed of incredible banquets so vividly they woke up still tasting the rich meat on their tongues. Others confessed that their mothers or their wives appeared to them, whispering kind words that carried them through the cold. And then there are the odd fragments of folklore. Soldiers told stories of men who dreamed of strange fires, sacred flames that were said to follow deserving armies. And these flames promised their ultimate survival against all odds. Some men believed these dreams were powerful omens sent from above. Others insisted they were just the fevered visions of men half frozen. Modern scholars still disagree about how much weight to give these accounts. Some treat them as simple exaggerations or literary flourishes, devices used by chroniclers to romanticize the men's suffering. Others argue they reflect a genuine psychological survival tool, the brain conjuring warmth because the body had absolutely none. Were these dreams fact or just metaphor? You pull your cloak tighter, your eyes still closed. You try to summon your own memory of a past warmth, a fire from your childhood, perhaps, or the heavy quilt you once hid under as a storm raged outside. But the harder that you try to remember, the more the present reality of the tent intrudes. The damp smell of wool and the deep ache in your joints. Around you the whole tent stirs with murmured dreams, dreams that are spoken aloud by the sleeping men. One man whispers about meat pies, his lips smacking softly. Another mutters the name of a woman over and over again. His quiet voice breaks into a half-sob in the darkness. Someone else shouts, suddenly jolted awake by a violent nightmare. You realize what keeps men alive in this place. It is not just their cloaks or their small fires. It is the stubborn insistence on remembering what warmth feels like, even if that feeling only comes to them during their sleep. You close your eyes again, trying to hold on to a scrap of warmth, borrowing comfort from a world that is now very far away. The comforting dream of home finally fades away. And when you open your eyes again, you understand something that has been building slowly all along through the night. Survival in these cold and damp tents. It has never been about just one single thing. It has always been about the will to keep going. You look around at the men still breathing. They are still stirring under their rough woolen cloaks, and you realize that their endurance is as much mental as it is physical. Sources from medieval campaigns repeatedly stress this very point. Morale was considered to be as vital as food or fuel. An army with warm cloaks but broken spirits could crumble. A cold army with high spirits could outlast a warm one whose men had already given up in their minds. The nightly cold in the tents tested not only the body's resilience, but it tested the strength of the mind as well. Men had to convince themselves each and every morning that survival was still worth the immense and painful effort. And sometimes they used the most unexpected methods. Accounts describe soldiers telling jokes that were crude or absurd. Men laughed until the tears literally froze on their cheeks. Others sang the simple lullabies from their distant childhoods. Their voices were cracking from the cold, but they were still determined. They played simple games, tossing dice in the dirty straw. There is still some debate among historians about what mattered more, the physical strategies of survival or the psychological ones. Some argue that no charm, no song, and no happy memory could ever truly fight off the bite of deadly frostbite. Others insist it was precisely these fragile mental rituals that carried soldiers through, allowing them to rise at dawn and march again. You pull your own worn cloak a little closer now, not just against the cold, but as if you are shielding your thoughts. Around you, the other bodies shift restlessly in the gloom. One man snores loudly, while another mutters a quiet prayer. The tent creaks under the wind's constant assault, but it still stands against the force of the night. Picture the camp as dawn approaches one final time. The fires are guttering, their smoke drifting thin against the pale light. The horses stamp their hooves, their breath steaming in the air. Men stumble out of the tents, their shoulders hunched. It looks like a scene of pure misery from a distance, but up close, it is a quiet miracle of raw persistence. You realize, lying there in your own small corner of straw, that the true weapon against freezing to death was always stubbornness. Cloaks can tear and straw can rot, and fires will always sputter out, but the simple human will to keep moving through the dark that outlasts the cold. That is why the medieval soldiers survived, because their minds were stronger than the frost. So now, as you let yourself drift into a deep sleep, imagine the flickering glow of a medieval campfire fading into embers. The low tents stand weary against the pale dawn. Their canvas is patched and sagging from the long night's fight, yet still they shield the weary bodies curled beneath their cloaks. The struggle for the night is finally over for them. You can hear the final rhythm of the snores, the occasional cough, and the last murmur of a prayer, whispered into the smoky and now quiet dark. Outside, the frost gathers silently on the ropes and the poles, but inside the men cling stubbornly to one another, to their memories, and to the last scraps of their shared warmth. The story of how these soldiers slept is a deep one, wrapped in wool and pressed against their comrades for heat, guarded by fragile fires and even by their own simple faith. It tells us something more than just military history. It reminds us that survival is never about achieving perfection. It is about finding just enough to carry you through the night. Tonight, as you lie safely beneath your own warm blankets, you might picture yourself in that distant and cold tent. You can almost feel the rough wool scratching against your cheek. You can hear the canvas strain against the force of the wind, and you can smell the smoke seeping deep into the fabric. But you also feel the quiet determination that bound those men. Let your own breathing begin to slow down now. Let your body sink deeper into the softness of your bed. The cold and the noise belong to another time entirely, another place that is now very far away from you. You are safe where you are, and the world outside your own shelter can wait until the morning. Sleep like those soldiers once were forced to sleep, not in any kind of comfort, but in sheer endurance, knowing you have already made it through the hardest part of the night. If you have enjoyed our journey into the past, please remember to subscribe. Subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes. For now, rest well and sleep deeply. The dawn is coming.